Good afternoon. Ni hao. Welcome back from lunch. I am the personal avatar of Mary Gallagher and director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, who unfortunately cannot be with us here today, as she has a previous commitment to something else. But I would just like to say a couple things about the center and also Mary's work there with her colleagues. Over the last 10 years of her work at the center, Mary's really expertly evolved and substantially grown the center from its days, in early days from 1961 to the present day, and having the center just been recently renamed Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. Sometimes we name centers after two white men in China, but that's a different thing. So thanks for the support, especially Eric, Ina, and Carol, who were pivotal in the Wang Qingsong Beijing-Detroit exhibition. And also for supporting our program called Base Beijing, which I'd just like to talk a little bit about the backstory of that, or maybe give you a sense of how we all ended up in the room today. I think, thanks to Natsu for your work today too, and the work on the entire exhibition and planning. It's really fantastic. And I don't know if Lucy Fry is here, but from Nandy's Knowledge Cafe. Yeah, great. So just, I think when she arrives, I want to make sure to thank her for the good work that she provided during the photo shoot, which happened on a really brutally cold day, like a bone-chilling day in Detroit, on this ruined site, this building that had fallen into ruin. It was one of the most hazardous job sites I've ever been on, and I'm an architect, and so it's kind of a miracle that nobody was injured. So what I really am is I'm an associate professor here in architecture. I also have an appointment in art and design, and I direct the University of Michigan Initiative on Disability Studies. All those things sort of are compounded into maybe some of the comments I'll make today. So I'm primarily interested in how cities are made, how they're unmade and remade, and what the process of making, unmaking, and remaking tells us about the cultures we presume to produce and participate in. In 1989, I'm sure many of you were also in this similar moment in 1989, but maybe in different spaces. I was living in a small liberal arts university and monastery with a group of international colleagues from Somalia, Brazil, Germany, France, Italy, and China. And during that time, we would have these amazing cooking parties and, long table in the corridor. The food was, just incredibly polyvalent all over the place and wonderful as these kinds of international occasions happen and provide. And, one particular late night, I remember distinctly a friend, Wang Qingsong. He opened the door to the hallway party, and he stood there for a moment and he said, and I won't ever forget this, he sort of looked at me directly in my eyes and he said, "You are so aggressive, and I am so peaceful." It was just a couple of weeks later that we were all gathered around the television, watching our fellow students and Chinese friends. I remember watching this, through the night and all day long. Peacefully protesting one day, as you can see here in this image. And then the next day, of course, the events of Tiananmen Square, brutality waged against the state, against the students, et cetera, played out, which changed everything relative to my thinking about the city and its politics. It's also at the time that when I came here to the University of Michigan, I was interested in starting a program in Beijing because this is early 2000s. China had half the world's construction cranes, on the planet in China building the city. So this is this moment of kind of architectural euphoria, a city like Beijing was completely just coming unglued in all sorts of ways. There was, the trauma of unmaking things in the city, but also I think the kind of, veracity and energy about architecture was, it had architects in a complete, both kind of delirium, but also delusional state about their project. And so we spent, a lot of time, trying to figure out what's going on in China relative to the making of this city. And I met Wang Qingsong, who's right here. This is her just a couple of years ago. I think she'll be joining us maybe later today. So I invited her into the studio and I said, can you give us, some insight onto gender politics in China and, tell us a little bit about your work. So Wang Qingsong is a very famous women's rights activist and also scholar relative to women's studies. And she gave this amazing talk that really sort of broke down preconceptions one might have, or we had, I think, as university students and faculty, about the image of Chinese women from the late 19th century to the present day. And it was this really beautiful, like 3-hour, talk, just kind of unwinding and winding up these different kinds of itineraries. And so at the end of the talk, I asked Professor Zhang, I said, we're going to Beijing next week, what should we go see? And I was fully expecting her to say, oh, you should go see, the Imperial Palace, blah, 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 Summer Palace, and so on. And she looked me in the eye and she said, you have to go to the Kentucky Fried Chicken in Tiananmen Square. And I looked at her and I thought, you gotta be kidding me. And she didn't crack a smile or anything. She was actually quite serious. So the first thing I did when I flew to Beijing is I went to the Kentucky Fried Chicken. I mean, straight from the airport to Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I went up to the 3rd floor. It's a 3-story building. And looked out the glass window. It's in the southeast corner of Tiananmen Square. And out that window, you could see all sorts of things. You could see security personnel, migrant workers, tourists, lone fire extinguishers sort of planted across Tiananmen Square. And then behind the building, and then all the etiquette around KFC and indoctrinating, workers into franchise, sort of work. But then directly behind the building, the city was unmaking itself in preparation for the Beijing Games. And so this kind of sort of dual action of how cities are unmade and remade and mutually constructed really caught my fascination relative to things happening in China. The next year, we started a program called BASE, Beijing Architecture Studio Enterprise, with my colleagues, our colleagues, and good friends Robert Mangurian and Marianne Ray. They're based in Los Angeles. And we had one of the buildings, if you've been to Deshanza 798, these amazing buildings that were designed by East German Bauhaus-trained architects with the beautiful sort of light wells and so on. We had procured one of those buildings and had spent time designing it, sort of retrofitting it, investing a little bit of money into it, with the hope that we'd start an independent school that University of Michigan and a few other institutions around the world would support as a kind of independent design research unit in this, up-and-coming arts district called 798 at Deshanza. And 3 days before we had 40 students showing up from Michigan and a few other institutions, the son of the mayor of Beijing, this is sort of how typical son of mayors do this, came in and said, sorry, we're actually negotiating with MoMA, Guggenheim, and Centre Pompidou for this space, and you're out. So, my friends Robert and Marianne were completely depressed, dejected, ready to really throw in the towel. And so I realized, well, nonetheless, we have 40 students coming, so we have to figure it out. So we started making calls. We called you and a few other people. We called Ai Weiwei, Robert Burnell, who was the publisher at Time Zone 8 Books. And finally, Weiwei said, you should come over to Xiaochengdi. There's a building right across the street from our studio that's, there's a space that's available. And so we went to this building. It's on the south side of that urban village. And the building had no doors. You can see an image of it here. No doors, the windows are blown out, and there was about this much Gobi desert sand on the floor. And I was like, shit, we're screwed. And Robert, who's a bit older than I, we call him Robert the Elder, I'm Robert the Younger, he said, this is perfect, let's go for it. And I was like, okay. So, the following day, we had students there, we handed out dust masks and brooms, and we swept the floors. And then within a week, and you could only do this probably at this moment in China, in Beijing, we had electricity, running water, a toilet, internet, and the start of a shop where we were actually fabricating all the furniture with the students. So it was this, students are coming into China thinking, oh, let's go see stuff. And we were like, let's get to work here. It was a lot of fun. The students were great and so on. And, in no short order, we took this space that was, pretty rough and converted it into a really amazing, studio space. In the front of the building was Universal Studios, the gallery run by P. Lee and Wallingsborg. They've since changed the name to Wallingsborg Gallery, I believe, or Lee Gallery. And in the back of the building, there was this funny, custom bus company tricking out buses, tour buses, and then a Korean animation studio that was converted into a Baptist church on Sundays, and it was this kind of weird thing, So some of the things we started doing at base, we went and visited all the architects, in the city, a few who've been, really good friends and so on. And then we visited all the Olympic sites that were under construction at the time. And we had this idea, let's design this baseball cap, a very American, sort of iconographic kind of headgear. And we would give it to, people that we would meet out there in the city. So in English, it said base, and then the translation into Mandarin, GD. And we gave it to the contractor. There's two contractors for the National Stadium, and he looked at it and he said, no, I'm not taking the hat. Because it turns out base, when you translate it, Mandarin, also means Al-Qaeda. so, quite instantly we're sort of falling down. The other thing that was, at this time, Beijing was the greenest city on the planet. Every building was green, covered in this construction cloth. This is a project by our friend Chung Yong-he. And this cloth was, it was an interesting material, and both Robert and Marianne and I are interested in the making of things and material culture in general. And so we're always collecting materials, different kinds of tools, just because we're interested in those types of artifacts. And of course, we encounter this kind of iconographic jacket, the blue worker's jacket in China. And so we bought these things when we would wear them and feel good that we're comrades with each other. And then we started doing things like this, like translations and making skeuomorphs, things that are made out of other things that simulate other things. So this is taking the blue worker's jacket. We this is a 5 times large version of it, scaled up to the scale of a building. So it's thinking about the workers' bodies, construction workers, migrant workers on a job site, but then scaling up this jacket to the scale of architecture. And this piece is toured in a number of biennales in China and in the United States. And we have another version that's actually twice the size of this thing. This is all made in a local shop in Xiaochengdi. So some of the work that we've been doing at base includes exhibitions, a lot of exhibition design, curation, number of projects. So this is in Deshanze for Beijing Biennale a few years ago. And then, we would spend time, meeting architects, and the architects, because of the demand of high-speed urbanization and all the projects they had, their work was right in front of their nose, right? So they had no capacity to reflect on or let alone theorize what was going on in the city. They were just making it. And frankly, they didn't, both international, also Chinese architects, didn't have a lot of time just to sit around and talk with a bunch of visiting students from, Michigan. And so we started seeking out artists and other people in creative industries, and this is when we intersected with Zhang Fong and Wang Qingsong and others. Fong started teaching in the program, kind of history of 20th century and 21st century art production in China. and then also coordinating, studio visits to go see, amazing artists. So on one such visit to someone we all know, Ai Weiwei, he's a sort of interesting character for sure, but the last time I was there, we walked in the door with a group of students, and without saying, "Oh, welcome, hello, nice to see you again," he just came up to me and he said, "We must revolutionize education." And he sort of does that. This is Mary Gallagher and Weiwei. And then this image shows up. There's a few references to this piece this morning, and to me, relative to disability studies, this piece really resonates. To the narrative of making, unmaking, and remaking, right? So dropping something that has value, and in fact to fragment it, to disaggregate it, to disable the object is something that I'm quite interested in. So a key theory in disability studies is a simple statement like, in contrast to perceiving a disabled body as someone living a life of hardship, suffering, and challenge, and pain, etc., what if we thought of disability? I identify as a disabled person. What if we thought of disability as a creative practice that produces really unique types of knowledge, and that those types of knowledge innovate, ways that we think about our bodies, but also ways that we think about the city. In disability studies, we talk a lot about like embodiment and human-centric sort of things, and I got interested in thinking about, let's say, theories in disability studies and winding those up into theories about the city. In fact, cities that are in processes of like unmaking themselves, what's innovative about that, aside from the obvious traumas and displacements of entire social groups and sectors in those cultures. Another visit with Weiwei, he tends to speak in these long, kind of winded, they're not tirades by any means. He's really generous with his time. But I also remember one time he made this statement. He said, "In the West, you teach people how to be superpowers, and in the East, we teach people how to be people." This is some collaborative work with Qingsong, a photo shoot. This piece, artists and others on the wall are all the names of like the top universities and colleges internationally. And then on this long ladder were students from our program, all women from different nationalities and backgrounds, pretending to read a Chinese textbook. Qingsong working on site. We added our thing base to that list. Disability studies. I want to show you this quick image because I think it speaks to the unmaking thing. So in downtown near the intersection Jiaodeko, there's a series of really famous hutong, and the government was widening the road to run the Olympic marathon, as a way of decommissioning those spaces, and in effect evicting people, getting people to move out. The workers were taking like a bite out of the building here, like a bite out of the kitchen, and then 50 meters down, a bite out of the threshold, a bite out of living space in order to sort of render those houses inoperable. I'm going to jump just a little bit. 25 years later, after my friend Wang said, "I'm so peaceful, you're so aggressive." You remember this day? 25 years after, Tiananmen. We were in Xiaochengdi. Fang had arranged a series of artist visits. There were these white military helicopters like flying over the village, sort of, there were a lot of people on the ground. Nothing was happening in the village except everyday stuff, but nonetheless there was this interesting presence of this work. Artist, performance artist Hu Chunyao, meeting with her at her studio. Lan Lan, the rising star of Beijing opera, coming to perform at the studio. Fong always with one of three boys. And then our other close friend, the performance artist, He Young Chung, Chung. You might know his work, 1 Meter for Democracy, where there was a surgeon slit from his shoulder down to his, his upper thigh, 1 centimeter deep cut. So his body, I think, and he's done something like the museum in Brussels where he wore a pair of very simple pajamas, walked out in the lobby of this museum with a handful of lighters and proceeded to burn off his clothes, incinerating all the clothes until he was ashen and burned and nude. So, he's somebody, and we've had a lot of conversations about the body as a kind of cartographic map of the body. Like his body is also, I think, holding a lot of the cartographic practices of the city of Beijing in terms of making, unmaking, and remaking. So we did a performance, but also kind of study of his body where in the studio we used a 3D laser scanner and scanned his entire body, and then computationally we unrolled this and flattened it and made it into a kind of carpet. I love this photo. This is like a 1970s sort of like. This is on the site in Detroit. Wang Qingsong is always doing this, like directing traffic, and then Fong is always gently prodding people into place, and you can get a sense of the landscape a little bit around this. I wanted to throw this triptych in just to pitch it next to the Ai Weiwei dropping the urn, right? So there's the famous 3 photos of Weiwei dropping the vase, which is, the kind of unmaking thing. But I like this image more because it's the artist like putting on the jacket and going to work and thinking about ways that, even though the world is completely broken, the role of art might be to repair and reassemble the earth. And I think a lot of Qingsong's work and Fong's work is, we need artists like this to help us figure those things out. Fun.